now I just really, really, really want to watch The Martian again. Hey there, interwebs! I am back for another book review. Well, technically audiobook, because I really listen to more audiobooks. I don't really have the time to sit down and read anymore in my life. But anyways, a book review of Project Hail Mary, the new book by Andy Weir, the author of both The Martian is probably his most famous work, but also Artemis, which I also read and thought was a really, really good book. But I was really excited to sit down and read Andy Weir's new book because I really love his sort of scientific mind and how he sort of builds this scientific puzzle box of a story that the characters usually have to work through. Martian was probably a bigger evidence of this, but Artemis did that as well. And that's just a kind of a storytelling that I really, really love. I mean, I love puzzle box science, like rules-based storytelling. Like, for example, I know this is going to be a strange comparison to make, but it almost reminds me a little bit of Death Note, where you have a universe where it sets up these rules and everything is just playing out those rules. And for Andy Weir, the rules just happen to be heavily influenced by real science, even though he's setting it in a science fiction setting. It's just, I really love that type of storytelling. It's like, here are the rules of this universe, and now we're just going to have the characters set off in this and do something with it. And that's very much the case here with Project Hail Mary. The whole concept of this story, just to give you sort of a brief synopsis, and I'm not going to go too deep into spoilers. I'll tell you, there's one point where I will have to talk about spoilers because it's so integral to my enjoyment of the novel, but I'll let you know when we get there. So spoiler free up front, and then we'll get into some spoilers, especially a big spoiler later on. So spoiler free, the basic concept of this novel is we wake up with the character Ryland Grace, who's woken up from a coma but has amnesia, and he finds himself on a starship, and he has no idea why he's there, what's going on, and what he's supposed to do. And he sees the other people around him are also, the other astronauts are dead, and so he's sort of left with this lingering question of like, okay, what's happening, what's going on, what am I here to do? And the basic plot of that side of the story is a gradual unfolding of him figuring out what's going on, figuring out what's happening, and just sort of going along for the ride. But the real fun of this side of the story is it's all based on the character's deduction. He's basically looking at the world around him, seeing what's going on, and basically comes to like, okay, so if this is the case, then this must be true. Like if this ship has gravity, okay, so that means there's some centripetal force going on here. Or, you know, the stars are look this way, so maybe I'm in this part of the galaxy without spoiling too much. So all of that is, I just really love that sort of deduction that this character goes through. But the other part of this novel, too, is that he starts piece by piece to get his memory back. And we start getting these scenes of flashbacks of his time before he was on this ship and sort of leading into what caused him to be here. And this might have seemed initially to be like a bit of an overused structural trope of like, here's the present, here's the past, and we sort of like jump back and forth between the two. I mean, it's not a bad choice. I mean, many stories have done that, but it would have just been sort of a standard choice. But what I liked about this decision to structure the story this way is every flashback that we get is the character of Ryland Grace getting his memory back at that exact moment. So every single time we come back from a flashback scene, we immediately we come back to the present. Grace is sort of being like, oh, okay, that's a new piece of information that gives me context for what's going on here, and moves forward with that piece of context. So all of this is him figuring it out with us, and the flashback sequences, which happen sequentially, sort of allow him to figure things out too, and also affect his emotional state, because the things that he learns from his flashbacks affect his emotional state in that moment. So if he learns about something horrible from the flashback sequence, he feels the immediacy of it in the moment that we read it as well. He feels the emotions of it that we feel as well. And I really loved that sort of new twist on this sort of flashback trope, because the character is feeling it and getting it at the same time we are, and it affects the present moment. So everything seems to have this forward momentum, even when we're looking into the past, and affecting what we learn in the present. It's really, really fascinating stuff, and just really, really enjoyable. So with all that being said, now I have to get into some light spoilers, and then I'll reveal the big spoiler, and we can talk about that. But I'm going to get into a little bit of light spoilers. So if you still want to, like, haven't read the book, but you want a little bit more context, don't worry. I'm not going to give away the big stuff, but because this is stuff that you learn in, like, the first third of the novel. So we ultimately learn that he has been sent on this mission into another solar system to stop. We learn there's basically these algae destroying the sun, and they find that there's this other sun, hundreds of miles, like a different, star system, so light years away, that isn't dying, even though it's also infected with the same sort of like star algae. And so he's sent there to this new solar system to try and figure out why is this solar system not dying and how can I bring it back to Earth. And so there's this sort of sense of like really immediacy and urgency, and yet also the frustrating sort of limits of real science and real technology. He can't just, this isn't Star Trek. We can just go out and do things. He has to really think through every single step he takes, because there's only so much that he can do with the limits of the technology he has. We ultimately learned that this was just a very like quickly put together mission. And so some of the tools that he has on hand are only the limits of some of the tools that he was able to get basically back on Earth. And so all of that is just really, really fascinating. And I just liked seeing him being like, oh crap, there's this problem that I did not anticipate. No one anticipated. What can I do with the tools on hand, the information that I have to try to figure it out? It's just so much fun. And it's very similar to The Martian in that way. But the other thing that I like better than The Martian is that Ryland Grace is a much more fully fleshed out character than Mark Watney was over in The Martian. Mark Watney was a fine enough character, but he was really just like, I am stoic astronaut. Here, Ryland Grace, and I don't want to spoil too much, he is not an astronaut. He is just a normal everyday dude who has been put in an extraordinary situation. How he got in this situation, I won't spoil, but he's just an everyday guy, and it allows him to have a little bit more personality, a little bit more fun to him than Mark Watney had. And I really just enjoyed that. Like, he felt a very relatable character. I also should say, if you listen to the audiobook is narrated by Ray Porter, who's the same guy who does the We Are Bob novels, which took me a second because Ryland Grace and Bob are similar, but not exactly the same type of character. And so I was sort of like trying to separate the two because the Ray Porter's performance. But that being said, Ray Porter does a fantastic job of really giving a lot of life to this character. I love his performance. And so if you're an audiobook fan, I would highly recommend Ray Porter's version of this audiobook. But if you're reading the book too, I can imagine that the character just pops out of the page as well. Ryland Grace just feels more fleshed out. He's not the biggest character. He doesn't have the most depth of any character that I've read before. I mean, you still get the sense that Andy Weir is more science first, story first, than he is character first, but you really get the sense of him flexing his character muscles with this, and I really, really enjoyed that. But that brings us into our biggest spoiler. So if you have not read the novel, please stop here, because this is going to spoil some of the bigger parts of the novel, and that is going to be the final piece that I want to talk about, and that is the introduction of the character of Rocky. Rocky, who is an alien character who comes alongside and meets Ryland Grace in the solar system because his civilization is also dealing with the same exact problem, and so they sort of did very much the same stuff. And Rocky is such a wonderful, adorable character. I loved Rocky so much. He was just so much fun and cute. And again, Ray Porter's performance of Rocky as a character was just so sweet and adorable and just made me smile. Like, the way that they communicate with each other and learn to communicate with each other is just so sweet. Like, they say things over and over again, like repeatedly, several times, like same, or excite. Like, it's just very adorable character. And I loved, again, science first, like the way that this character Rocky feels. So this character Rocky, he's basically a giant spider, and that can feel very dehumanizing and make it very hard to relate to this character. But ultimately, he felt even more human and relatable than Ryland Grace did. I ultimately just really, really found Rocky to be so adorable and wonderful and just a true joy to read. And ultimately, I'm kind of sad that the novel's done because I wanted to spend more time with Rocky. He was just adorable, and I loved him. And it's also like learning more about like why his species evolved this way, the differences between humanity and Rocky's people, Iridians, was kind of fascinating to learn, and sort of the amount of thought that Andy Weir put into creating a entirely different species. My only sort of thought on that would be, while there's a lot of thought into the biology and evolution of Rocky as a character, his speech patterns, while distinct and different enough, there's not enough like individual idioms. Like I feel like the character's communication comes across a little bit too easy. That he's adorable on his own, but I ultimately feel like there's a little sense of lost realism with their ability to communicate so easily. But I also like that he sort of thought about the differences in how they would think, because humans and Iridians have different ways of processing information just biologically, which I found also to be really, really interesting as well. So ultimately, I found it to be really, really thoughtful. One of the deepest sort of explorations of a character overall. I think the only down I would put on is some of the language stuff. I feel like you could have given a little bit more idiosyncrasies in the language to Rocky, but overall, I think it was just fascinating as a character. So in the end, this story, I really loved Project Hail Mary. I thought it was a really sweet story, a really fun ride. It sort of hit those perfect notes for me of a story where I love the logic puzzle of a story where, again, you have set rules and you just set us off on those rules, and it's very clear what those rules are, and we sort of are just dealing with what we deal with within those rules. I loved that stuff. But the characters and the situation were so fascinating on their own as well that I just really loved them, and how the flashbacks unfolded and the emotional reveals that come from the flashbacks were also very interesting, even though a little bit predictable at certain points. So ultimately, is this the best novel, the deepest novel that I've ever read? No, but it is a lot of fun. The characters are really good, and it was just engaged my brain the entire way through, while also still being a fun romp with really fun and adorable characters. So if you have not read Project Hail Mary, I would highly recommend it. I deeply enjoyed it, and I'm looking forward to Andy Weir's next project, because everything he's done so far I've really enjoyed. Even Artemis, which I know a lot of people thought was a step back for him, for me I found to be not his best, but certainly a really enjoyable novel as well. So Andy Weir is definitely on one of my favorite authors lists at the moment. So yeah, that's my thoughts about Project Hail Mary. Did you like it? Did you enjoy it? I'd love to hear all your thoughts down in the comments below. But beyond that, thank you so much for watching. Oh, don't forget to subscribe as well, but don't forget, and words, live long and stay sexy, folks. I'm a professional.